Okay, so here is Der Weltkrieg Systems, Western Front, 1914 to 1918. This is a update. They originally published this as just the Schlieffen Plan, and now as part of, sort of the whole conglomeration or expansions, etc., to it to include the whole war, I guess, and well, on this map, and the whole war exists in various modules that are already out, and it's being republished slowly, along with now available, I understand, the campaign game for the whole thing. It's a monster when you put it all together. It may be time-wise a monster even with this. I'm going to give this a shot to try to do the whole war on the Western Front. We'll see how far I can get. So far, nothing stymied me in terms of length yet. But the worry here is the turns are essentially 4 days long. And, well, there's a lot of pieces on the board, you can see. So I don't know if I'll make it or not. Let me explain briefly what I'm going to do here. First of all, I'm going to give my intro and a little bit of the rules. I'm giving my intro right now. At some later point, I'm going to be zooming in on specific systems because I know that that's what the designer, Dave Schrader, wanted to see. I don't know if anybody else is going to be doing that, but I'm going to try to do that, even if that's not my forte. I usually do it anyhow. I may end up cutting those pieces out of the middle of normal playthroughs and providing them as a separate resource if they're any good. All right. So when you look at this game, the first thing you notice is the map has these strange geometric distortions on it. And this is kind of the thing that always gets the most press with the game. It's an attempt to show a division of terrain within a given hex. So for example, this hex here, most of the hex sides are considered to have clear terrain, but part of it's going to have broken terrain. And this isn't just a hex side effect, it's where the defender sits. And we'll see how that works within the system. I want to give a little bit of history on this from when I know it. A friend of mine picked this up, I think the year it was first published, which is not 2004. 2004 is the first year, I guess, for this Western Front portion of it. But the original Schlieffen Plan was significantly earlier in publication, and he was very excited about it. And I was kind of interested because although I'm not a big operationals game fan, and my enjoyment of OCS convinced me to give this a serious shot. And in fact, the designer was looking for people to give some promotional. So I actually got a free copy for this. This is, I think, the first time I've gotten a free review copy. There should be a couple more, but I'm going to limit that. Anyway, he was very, very excited about the game. But I never heard anything about it after that. He was showing it off. Hey, you got this detailed plans here. The design philosophy for this seems to be keep the game complexity as low as possible in terms of rules complexity, but try to get a certain level of realism with unit strength numbers. So I think the designer was very careful. He had seen a number of games that just hadn't gotten that right, in his opinion. I don't have a great deal of enough historical knowledge to be able to judge that, and I certainly don't have experience with the games, especially operational games, to be able to say, yeah, Europa just got it all wrong. Nor will I be able to really be able to give that decision here. Basically, I'm giving a piece of trust to the designer here that, well, since he had disputes with those, perhaps he's managed a better job here. He's also taking into account a lot of factors that some of the simpler systems don't take into account, but he does it, again, with a minimum of rules, I think. There are a few things that do disturb me, though. Outside of, the map, it's not so much that I think I'm not going to be able to handle playing with this division, the extra information on the map. It's more a matter of it's aesthetically unappealing to see these harsh geometric divisions on here. And that's one minor issue here. Another, there's some things that are a little hard to see. So, for example, there's a concept of city centers here, which I believe are these, whereas there's urban and suburban terrain, and I have a hard time telling them apart. So this looks like a city center. It's got that shape and everything, but I'm looking in Paris as an example, and I'm not sure I can tell a difference between the urban and the city center, or whether there even is a city center. There's a little bit of darkness here that might be it. That's a little disturbing here. And as we go through the rules, I may point out a couple of places where I think they're a little bit more ambiguous, or perhaps don't have the cross-referencing you'd expect from a game that's lasted this long and gone through this many editions. Now, this is only the 3rd edition. I see online there's a Living Rules of the 5th edition. I looked that up to peek really at one thing I had a question about in the rules, which had to do with, I'll touch it when we hit it, but as well probably, but with major and minor rivers, if you have both, if you're crossing both at the same time. So if I was attacking from here to here, across both a minor river and a major river, the way the rules are written, there would be no effect. Because you must all be attacking across a major river, or all attacking across a minor river, in order to be affected by either. Now that seems a little unreasonable. I'd give the lesser effect. But again, there's little things like that that I feel you have to kind of fill in the gaps on. There were also, when I set it up, I noticed some of the strength point counters didn't match the setup rules precisely. Now, when I flipped the counters over on their reverse side, they were closer. So I went with that. Again, trying to guess. I don't want to mark up my counters. I can't tell which to give precedence to. So be warned that you may have to make some little corrections like that. There's also a part of the map here, for good or bad, that's used up for advertising space. For me, or branding space. For me, it's fine because it gives me room to put all these tracks. You also have a turn record track over here. And I've got my reinforcements set out. Actually, I should only have them set out until November for Schlieffen. Things sort of start changing partway through November, where the game takes sort of these general rules for replacements and supply points and such not. I'll have to correct that as I go. All right. Anything else? We got standard units here, with your attacks or combat strength and a movement value. Nothing exciting there. There's a little number. It's hard to do this with my hand. A little number in a circle up there. That indicates the maximum strength of that kind of unit when being replaced. And that's kind of important because there are some units, I don't know if I've got them on the board, that are actually larger than their maximum. I think the French Guards, for example, I don't know, those colonials are not. And that actually affects some other things as to what kind of replacement points you can use, etc. You've got supply tracks, and this may actually be, these should be at 100. There's no space for 100, but things can get up to 100, and these guys start there. So that's 200, 275, 300. That's immediately in violation of another rule, so you kind of have to fudge that and say, okay, during the Schlieffen plan scenario, certain rules aren't in place. It's just, there's a lot of little pieces like that you've got to put together and kind of say, oh, wait a minute, this isn't quite right. Anyway, let's get into how the rules themselves work. You also have these core displays, which are really just places to put your counters. You can use some little core markers. I have some over here somewhere, in order to indicate units that are on the board. You also have Army headquarters. You also have another kind of core marker here, which is what happens when you put 3 units together. In terms of strength points, so that's an alternative way to show things. These are just supposed to be conveniences. I can understand going both ways, but okay, we'll leave that be. For the map, there's an intention that this system be used for all the early 20th century wars. Because of that, we've got World War II era railroad tracks, single and double. I haven't been able to find a World War II era single track that I can clearly identify, but I do see some places where there's dashed lines for a World War I track and kind of solid in there for the World War II. Again, maybe a little difficult to cope with. And there's some stuff that's not necessary for this game. For example, these production things, I'm assuming that these are going to come into play in the Grand Campaign, which has been put together. The Grand Campaign would be one monster, though, I think. All right, let's see what we got here. So, a turn, the game is divided into months. Those aren't your turns, but in between every month you have a special turn where the only thing that happens is you handle certain bookkeeping in regards to trench construction. You're able to start constructing a trench at this time, and then trenches that have already, well, actually first, trenches that have already been under construction for the past month turn into trenches that have been constructed. And you have these little markers, a little construction marker, and a little trench, which is very hard to see. Faint lines on it for that. Another one of the aspects on this is the strength reduction markers. So this game is essentially a strength point game. But here the designer made the decision to represent strength points on unit counters. So you have specific units that have a specific strength and can be filled up to certain sizes. It's not absolutely clear from the rules whether or not you're allowed to have more than one strength point modification marker. And also each unit has a reduced strength size as it would in, say, a step loss game, but you actually lose specific strength points, and you have to take those off the difference, and you can use the little counters to indicate things. If you could have more than one strength reduction marker, obviously it would be purely a strength point game. So between that and some other statements, although again there's an indication in the rules that it may be possible to do that, I've taken the assumption that you must be able to do it with one counter and flipping at most. The other indication in the rules as to that has to do with if you cannot take the strength loss. Well, you could obviously take it if you could use as many -2 markers as you liked and -1 markers, right? So I'm inferring that there has to only be one. All right. Then when we get to a normal turn, well, the sequence of play is not anything surprising here. You start off with a reinforcement arrival phase. Each player has their own phase, has their own turn. First, you have central powers, then you have the entente. A reinforcement arrival phase, you put your reinforcements on the map where they're claimed to go according to the rules. Again, in the campaign game, there will be some production in here to make up for that. Then we go to a movement phase, a combat phase, and a replacement recombination phase, and record keeping. Basically some administrative stuff at the end with both of those. So yeah, there was something I wanted to say there, but I don't remember what it was. All right. Ground movement is nothing too shocking here. You have your movement allowance, right? And you have a terrain effects chart, which unfortunately was put only on the back of the scenario book. You can photocopy it. It's kind of interesting, gives you the movement point cost for the different kinds of hex sides, and then some combat effects, which we'll touch when we hit the combat. There's a mixture of combat effects, which can be die roll modifiers as well as strength modifiers, depending on the terrain, depending on supply, and all kind of stuff like that. When you're moving, you pay the movement point cost of the hex side terrain that you're entering, which seems pretty simple, really. If I'm moving from this hex to this, I'm going to pay the clear. But if I'm moving across here, I've got to pay the broken terrain cost. Rivers and such not add to that as they would normally as hex side terrain. But the hex sort of is factored in with this hex side terrain for movement. There is, okay, you can't enter enemy hexes. Here we go. Okay, so you're always allowed to move one hex side per movement phase. This is a pretty standard idea, but there are restrictions to that. You can't cross a prohibited hex side, no shock there, but you can't do both of the following either. You can't move directly from an enemy zone of control to another and cross a hex side where you have to spend 4 or more movement points. Mountain units have a little loosening of that restriction. Basically, you can slip by the enemy, if you so desire, through their zones of control, as long as it's through clear enough terrain. It's just tough through harsh terrain. That seems a little weird to me, actually. I'm not sure what that represents, because if anything, it would seem like forces would be projecting their power better over clear terrain. But okay. If most ground combat units can increase their movement allowance by 50%, as long as they're doing, I guess this is column movement. Yeah. As long as they don't move adjacent to an enemy unit. And they can leave an enemy-controlled hex and do this without it being a penalty. All right. Rail movement. Well, at the beginning of the game, I'm not going to be allowed to do any because everybody's pushing all the final supplies for the attacks, etc., to the front, I guess, on the rail lines, and maybe they're not coping with being able to move troops. But eventually, you can move units by rail. But in order to do so, the unit spends a movement point in order to entrain. It has to be an operative rail hex. So as you capture rail hexes, they become destroyed, essentially. There's no marker for this, but there are markers to cover the rail heads. So you can just move that back as territory is captured, and then there'd be kind of a no man's land between areas that have fallen. One interesting thing here, there's nice country boundaries for Luxembourg and Belgium and the Netherlands, but there isn't really one between France and Germany. There's this sort of line. Maybe there's a, yeah, we've got border in 1914, I guess, and maybe that's written, yeah, there's 1914 written in there. I don't know if there's a World War II border in there. There doesn't seem to be an indication of that. There's a 1919 border, though, supposedly. I didn't see that. But that's kind of hard to see. I don't know how big a deal it is for anything other than rail conversion. I'd actually thought that there were no borders. Okay, so you spend your movement point to entrain, and only the Germans can do this if they're in an enemy zone of control. And then it costs you essentially 1/10 of a movement point for every rail hex, as long as you're an infantry type unit. If you're not an infantry type unit, which is cav and not sure, probably the artillery has its own movement for this, so I don't think it's that. Cav and I guess engineers as well. They spend 1/6 of a movement point for each hex that they move by rail, which kind of, I guess, tries to balance out the cav, but I don't think it does terribly well for, say, engineers. You can't enter an enemy zone of control when moving by rail. However, German and British can move into enemy zones of control in the same turn that they used rail movement. Okay. Which is they can deep train in a space next to an enemy zone of control and then move into it. I thought they could run their rail right into an enemy zone of control, and that would be a little weird feeling. Now, single track rails, these dashed lines that look kind of like tracks, are limited to only allowing a single division or divisional equivalent. And essentially a divisional equivalent is 2 of just about anything else. Your brigades and regiments, 2 of them count as a division in this game for most cases. And there's little used markers. Oh, my hands are chewed up from clipping these counters. The counters are crap. Side mounted, so you can see there's little tabs on them, and they cut my fingers up when they do it. But there's a little used symbol on that, and you put that on the segment of rail track that can't be reused. Now, the Germans are able to move 2 units across single track, and they do not have used symbols on the back of their railheads. They have another railhead. That, I think, is a counter misprint, but I don't know. Everything else seems to have them. You can remain entrained after your movement phase, and you got a little entrained marker, and there's additional used markers here to help with that. So each country also has their own rail limit that they can use on their network, and Germany has the best, I think, and France next, and then Belgium is pretty small, but they have a very small rail network, right? And that's just how many divisions you can move over it. And there's no easy way to keep count of that with counters. You may have to use a railhead or something over on the supply track to keep track of that. That's what I'll probably do. All right. So during your movement phase, you're allowed to convert rail hexes. And in order to do that, you need an engineer. And this seems to be the only, well, one of 2 things that engineers are good at. Here are your engineer markers, no shock there. They have to start the turn on a rail hex. And then each movement point they spend, they turn that rail hex into an operative one. Now, things get a little tricky when you're playing on the East Front because of the different rail gauges. It's much, much slower to convert the railroads there, which means even though it's going to be very broad and open and maybe easier to make these big advances, it's going to be almost impossible to support them, and your army's going to run ahead of your rail line if you're not careful. Zones of control, only infantry type units, infantry, mountain, marine, and cavalry have a zone of control. One thing to specifically note is that replacement units do not. Now, unfortunately, my British replacements don't look so good. They look like this, and this is one of my grumps about it. They're almost unreadable that they're replacements. Well, if you get real close, you can. But other peoples, like say France's, have white print on them. All the British units have white print on them, so they had to use a different color, and they say RPL fairly clearly. Those aren't regular combat units. Those are just masses of men who are being trained and can be filtered into combat units, but they have no zone of control. They can't attack, and I think they're destroyed if they defend. I'm not sure about that. I don't remember. But you want to keep them behind the lines. They should not be being used, and it's fairly easy. You're able to recombine them back in the replacement recombination phase. And you can also add them to regular units that way. All right. Stacking. Stacking is 6 divisions in a space, but if there's no more than 3 land hex sides to a space, it's reduced to only 3 divisions. In addition to normal stacking, you can have up to 3 artillery units, fortress points, engineers, headquarters, obviously markers, and tanks. I believe you're allowed 3 tanks as well. I'm less familiar. I don't have those rules in front of me. They're later on in the game. All right. Well, we'll put a pause here. We'll go to combat. And I'll link these all together. Okay. For combat, in general, it's entirely optional. You have to be adjacent to someone, and you can attack them. And you can attack them with as many adjacent hex sides as you like. In order to do so, it may behoove you to pay some supply points, and this is where supply is used in this game. You don't have to worry about paying supply points for units that are on the board just to keep them alive. That is kind of a nice simplification, actually. I don't know how much of a problem that could cause, but in general, even when units are pocketed in a real war, you have to put some pressure on them to get them to surrender. So I don't think that that's a bad situation. So what happens is the attacker has the option to declare which units he's supplying. His headquarters has to be within 4 movement points, or else he's going to suffer a penalty. And it looks like it's a per unit or per counter penalty. So it seems that if you are attacking where your headquarters is maybe a little further away than you'd like, that's only 2 movement points. That's not bad. But there certainly will be situations where the headquarters are far away. For example, here, this would be more than 4 movement points away. And you're paying a penalty of 1 off the strength point of the unit for every hex over that. So that can accumulate pretty quickly if you're trying to make an attack from far from your headquarters support. If you don't pay supply, there's a minimum, which is you can attack with infantry type units at half their strength. I don't remember which way it's rounded. So clearly, if you're too far away from your headquarters, you just don't supply it, and you can still make the attack. The defender is under no such restriction usually. Now, in wintertime, these are modified. The defender has to be within 4 as well and suffers the same kind of loss. And the attacker has to actually be within 3 during winter turns. Both sides come up with their strength. The attacker comes up with his strength, spends his supply points, can announce that. The defender is allowed, after the attacker determines how much supply he's paying, to decide whether or not he's paying supply. Again, you probably want to. And the reason is this, because essentially the combat in this is going to be, like many strength point games, a fire table type thing. Think Empires and Arms here, for example. So the defender is going to be paying, again, supply points for his units. Now, the amount of supply that you pay per unit it's not per unit, it's per strength point. And certain countries pay more per strength point than others. I think the Germans pay 1 for every 4 strength points, the French 1 for every 3, for example. That's all specified in the scenario books and is dependent upon, well, whatever the situation is in the war at the time, but also the armies themselves. The defender has, well, after this, the attacker rolls, and we have two different combat tables. One for up to 1916, and one slightly more damaging one after 16. What you do is you just look up your strength points that you have and roll a die against them. Now, no, wait, what do we have here? No, here's the cost. I'm sorry, it was 8 and 6. Counterattacking is more expensive. It takes more supply, it takes more supply to counterattack, actually, for the units, because you only get 4 strength points for the Germans when you're counterattacking and 8 when you're attacking. But the counterattacker, and remember, he's probably got machine guns, which is why it's costing more, is got a force multiplier on here. Now, that's usually going to be ×3. So it's very painful to attack in this game. The defender is going to have a big multiplier on how many points of firepower he has. And then you cross-reference to the die roll, and you get an amount of casualties that you cause. Now, the attacker rolls first. And if the defender wishes, he has the option to retreat after the attacker rolls the casualties. If the defender chooses to retreat, he takes a third less losses, I believe. Yeah, a third less losses. There's a lot of number crunching going in here. So, when I said, well, the rules complexity is low, but there's a mechanical complexity to the game with all these markers. And then there's going to be a mental mechanical complexity because the numbers on the counters, well, they're fair size. They're not too bad. At least as long as you're getting away from these, these big core units, but they're there for your help, really. The numbers are pretty consistent, so you can largely add them up, I think, fairly easily. We'll see. I'm a little worried about that because I'm bad at counting. But then there's also, these multiplications and additions and subtractions on a lot of things. And we'll see how much they kind of get in the way of the fluidity that you'd like in the game. All right. Or that I'd like. Some people like things that are more require more of that than I like. Okay. So the defender, if he does not retreat, is going to be multiplied by 3 and can make a roll on here. Now, he also has to spend supply, and his forces are halved if he doesn't spend that supply, just like the attacker. It's possible the defender will have to retreat, however. He'll have no choice. Now that happens if he's got to eliminate strength points equal to half his total unadjusted strength of his infantry, cavalry, and fortresses. Okay. But there are some exceptions to the required retreat rule. And there are more exceptions based on as we get later in the game, because trench warfare becomes much more static, which we'll hit when we get to the trenches. But units don't have to retreat if they're in a city. Now, here's where it's important that there's a city center hex and not just an urban hex side. Now, let me see if I can find a clear city center. Yeah, I can't distinguish it. I think it's this little block up here in Lille. So these hexes wouldn't defend you, but this one would prevent you from retreating. Okay. Or if he's in the same hex as a fortress. Now, a fortress changes things which says, okay, if you retreat from a fortress, you still take reduced losses, but all the losses have to come off the fortress first, which might actually save a fortress if you have a small force there, conceivably. And I don't see a problem with that necessarily. Okay, if you end up more than the 50 strength points, you wrap around and you go through multiple times with one die roll. The way losses are eliminated from units, and this is where I'm worried, very worried. Like I said, you have these little markers. You have the flip side of units, which is a reduced strength side. And you're essentially just reducing the strength points of your stack by the losses that you took to the best of your ability. There are some further restrictions on what you can do, which is you have to flip all your units over before you take further losses from units that are already flipped over. You have to use your fresh stuff first. A lot of games have that kind of concept in them. Die roll modifiers come, well, some of them come from the terrain effects, and you'll notice something interesting here. The attacker suffers a minus from bad terrain. The defender gets a bonus plus. Now, on his counterattack. When we look at rivers, we see the same kind of thing. And we see here with major rivers, and this is where I have a gripe about the rolls, have the attacker strength and you double the defender strength. But these happen only if they're fully attacking across that type of river, river or major river. Now I could take this and say, well, a major river is a kind of river, right? And I think that's what's intended here, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Trenches are a little different. We'll zoom in on them briefly here. They give you a -2 to the attacker's die roll, but no benefit for the defender's counterattack, which I find a little odd there. I'm not sure why that particular representation, why natural terrain defenses as opposed to the man-made ones are considered more advantageous, but they do stack. Up to 4 to the die roll. You can maximum modification to the die roll is plus or minus 4. Okay. Step back to retreating. Retreat rules are pretty standard in a sense, but there are restrictions as to which way you can retreat. So to begin with, you're going to be retreating in general in the direction of the headquarters that supplied you. But for the most part, these can all be violated. In fact, you can retreat through enemy zones of control if there's a friendly unit. And there's a whole very explicit listing of which thing you do first and which you do second. So the first choice is through clear terrain, not through clear terrain, but not the terrain doesn't matter, but through the closer in terms of movement points to your headquarters, without going through enemy zones of control. And then, you have different levels here. So an enemy controlled hex with friendly combat units is sort of later in the pause. And then you go down to going further away from your headquarters and then further away through an enemy zone of control that you have a friendly unit in. All very well spelled out there, I think. If you can't retreat in the optimal direction because of stacking or something, you can still go in one of the suboptimal directions. But if you cannot retreat at all, you're eliminated, and you're considered to have retreated for your counterattack. Of course, that would probably only happen if you were forced to retreat anyway. Retreating units that are attacked later in the phase, if that hex is attacked again, they don't count in. I don't think they can take losses either, but they retreat again from that combat if the defender retreats. You cannot retreat into a hex that you couldn't normally move into using the 1 hex per turn minimum move. And let's see. If you're able to use mountain or alpine defensive terrain, you don't have to retreat unless you're surrounded. Special rules for surrounding, which we'll touch in a bit. So if the defender retreats, the attacker can advance. Again, similar to many games, but there are restrictions on which attacking units can advance. It's the ones that were the most involved in the combat is the intention of this rule, but it's essentially the weakest units that get to advance first. So even if something weak didn't take any losses in that combat, it would still get the first advance. I think that's a reasonable abstraction. Once you get assault troops, they get to twist this, and they get to advance in precedence of other things if they wish. All right. Headquarters are generally just places to hold these supply points. That's their primary purpose in the game. They can transfer points amongst each other, and they can either do it by rail, in which case it costs against your rail capacity, or they can do it within 4 hexes of each other, the same as their supply range that they can kind of throw supply to the units. Headquarters can't retreat, and they'll be eliminated if they do so. Now, the game doesn't replace headquarters by any means other than it takes, I think, 3 months for them to come back. So that's a fairly long amount of turns in the game to be without a headquarters, so that'll be painful. I think we've touched the supply rules. What we haven't touched is surrounded units. Now, when a unit is surrounded, here's one of those kind of vague rules that I think anyone reasonable, including myself, could figure out, but I just want to point it out. A unit's surrounded if it can't trace a line of communication to a friendly map edge, country, interior, or operating port. Now, I don't remember anything discussing operating ports. I assume all ports are operating in this game, unless there's some rules to make them inoperable. But interior of the country, again, it's not really defined anywhere that I saw. Maybe there is a glossary somewhere, I think, that may contain that. Maybe I'm thinking of a different game. But I didn't remember hitting a definition of the term. So there's that kind of looseness, which I think is fine. But what is the interior of the country? I don't think it matters for this map. I think it's intended, and probably will be clarified, when you're using a multi-map scenario. For example, if I was doing the East and West front, there may be a gap between them. The interior of the country, well, okay, if there is no gap between them, Germany's interior would have to be kind of defined in some way. So I think any pocket created on this map is going to count, but I'm not sure. What if I pocket Paris? Are they in supply there? I don't know. I wish that had been more clearly defined there. But anyway, if you're surrounded, you're allowed to break out by attacking. And at that point, if you do that, 1 strength point of every division involved in the attack is eliminated. And I think that happens before the attack. Yep. And any losses incurred by surrounded units are surrenders, which is to say that if a unit's removed from the map completely when it's lost in this kind of situation, it's removed from the game. You can't replace it. And that's, again, pretty standard. A few restrictions. Surrounded units have some other penalties to them. They can't retreat from enemy zone of control to enemy zone of control unless there's a friendly fortress. A lot of specifics here to handle this. They don't get defensive benefits of trench markers. If a unit of most countries, Great Britain and Germany excluded, is completely surrounded in a pocket without a fortress, the units that are automatically destroyed if they sit the entire turn there, the entire friendly portion of the turn within a pocket. And for German and British, it takes 3 friendly game turns for that removal. So actually, they do handle supply in that sense, and that would include your headquarters and everything. If you can't trace back, to a safe place, fortresses though fix that. And in fact, if you're stacked with a fortress, you're not surrounded in any sense. Fortresses themselves are not allowed to attack. They don't have a zone of control. They don't negate enemy zones of control, except you can trace supply through them. Now, I don't know. I guess you can't retreat through them and stuff. There's a few things that negation of zone of control otherwise handle there, which works okay. But yeah, the biggie is that you can still trace supply through them. And of course, you could have a regular unit stacked with the fortress to make it good. You never have to retreat if you're with a fortress. I think we touched that. Fortresses counterattack at their full strength, and they don't need supply points to do this. And of course, that's their tripled strength because counterattacking is tripled. They don't count against stacking. If you take losses on your fortresses, there are, not here in these. Let's try to lift this without knocking everything over. There are some replacement fortress counters that you can use to represent smaller steps of the fortress. And I was kind of confused what they were for. That's all they're for, I guess. All the fortresses are on the map. You're not going to see new fortresses pop up the way you would in, say, La Grande Guerre. Okay. Trenches. Now, I've already gone into how you construct trenches. You construct them in the trench construction phase in between the months. And all the ones that are under construction become constructed. And then you can lay down new ones. And it doesn't look like you need engineers for this in general. The trench is going to add to the cost for entering the hex, regardless of who's in it. And it also gives a defensive bonus to the attacker in terms of a die roll modification. Now things get a little weird here. In order to force someone to retreat from a trench, you have to give the defender a strength point loss equal to or exceeding their total strength. That's the only way to force them to retreat. And they'd be destroyed anyway, right? So that's not a big deal. They only have to, at the beginning of the first turn of April 1915, trenches that aren't in an enemy zone of control are removed from the map. From now on, trenches can only be constructed in hexes containing an enemy zone of control. It doesn't say that they'll ever be removed again in this way. So it's just one weird point in time where you can't have defense in depth. From the rest of the game on, it looks like you can, from what I can see. But you can't build trenches ever again in a space without an enemy zone of control. And if an enemy zone of control disappears from that space, the construction marker is immediately removed. And you can't construct them where mountain or marsh is the only terrain between their hex and the hex is occupied by enemy units. Now, neither trenches nor devastation markers can exist in mountain or marsh hex sides and would not be included in the movement point cost for crossing such hex sides. That's interesting. Okay. Trenches that are not destroyed starting in April of 1915. Trenches are no longer destroyed by retreat in advance after combat. Let's see, I missed that somewhere, didn't I? Okay, no, here it is. Okay, so if a unit is ever found in a hex not to be completely occupied by a trench construction, that unit's removed from the map. Or that construction, no, that's the construction marker. Somewhere I got this. I'm not finding this. But I'm guessing that when you retreat from a hex, or when a hex is advanced into, I can't find the rule, it would normally be destroyed before April 1915. And now it's not. It's replaced with this devastation marker, which lasts for the rest of the game. And these little things have the same 2 movement point cost that trenches do, but no defensive bonus. Basically, the land's so chewed up there from the constant fighting that it's a no man's land. You can rebuild a trench, entrenchments across that. All right. Movement point cost of trenches, yeah. And devastation is included in calculating the supply line length and determining whether or not you're allowed to move it through it using the 1 hex minimum movement. So in 1915, even normal defensive terrain that has what, a -3 or better defensive die roll adjustment, you don't have to retreat from. You're not forced to. And then in 1916 on, that goes up to a -2 or better. Now, during 1915 only, and you know, it sounds like a lot of stuff here, but basically, like with La Grande Guerre, you learn the little modifications for each period of the game. During 1915 only, whenever you're worried about trench markers and this defensive bonus that allows you to not retreat can be eliminated by overwhelming artillery fire if you have both at least as many artillery batteries and siege artillery batteries as there are defending divisions. All right, let me fit this other one in if I can. And the same thing takes place if you have an attack coming from both the front and rear, opposite sides. Okay, continuing with combat. Artillery units. There's 2 different types of artillery, regular artillery and siege artillery. Let's see if, I don't think I have both in the Brits, but I do with the French. And you have these 2 symbols. Regular artillery looks normal. Siege artillery has these 2 little lines on it like a wall. And no, they're not all rail-based. Okay. You're allowed to stack 3 of these in addition to the 6 divisions in the space. They require supply to attack or counterattack. You don't get that half-point bonus there. Their counterattacking is only doubled, which I don't think is specified on here. It's somewhere in here, though. Artillery strength is doubled on the CRT column. If you do the supply expenditure. And this is pretty helpful, actually. This gives you a lot of the information you need for combat once you kind of have the mechanics down. I think that'll be all the sort of little quirks that you have to know are on there. Okay. You can also do artillery-only attacks against a fortress, or any artillery that are in the hex with that in the hex. So this would be an attack and counterattack only between artillery pieces. The only counterattacking forces are defending artillery, so the fortress does not get to shoot back. And you don't have to pay extra to enter an enemy zone of control with artillery if you have a friendly unit there. Okay, so when only artillery attack a fortress, they add 1 to the attack die roll for each hex side through which any artillery are firing. So if you can get kind of an arc of fire on a fortress, you get a bonus on your die roll for attack, which is pretty cool. If the number of infantry divisions in the fortress is less than the number of hex sides through which the artillery are attacking, the artillery is additionally doubled for the attack. Artillery are limited from making the 1 hex minimum move. They never retreat. If they're forced to retreat, they will be destroyed.